he wasn't there yet, but the Beatles were looking for a photo op. And I think that day in February 1964 was really me, the Beatles, and Cassius Clay. That was the beginning of the 60s.
Hi, I'm Nick Gillespie with Reason TV, and today we're talking with Robert Lipsyte. He's a legendary, widely acclaimed sports writer, novelist, and now he's going to be ESPN's new ombudsman come June 1st. Bob, thanks for talking to us.
My pleasure.
As
an old Reason subscriber, I'm very happy to be here.
I wrote recently when I read about you becoming ESPN's ombudsman that chances are people have read something that you've written, whether they like sports or hate sports, because for the past 45 or 50 years, I mean, you've been writing really insightful and wide-ranging essays about sports, young adult novels. My personal favorite is The Contender, which I was forced to read, and it was one of those books that made me understand required reading isn't always terrible. Other people love One Fat Summer. Let's talk first about ESPN. Your role as ombudsman. What will you be doing?
Well, that's a very good question. Any suggestions you have are welcome. I'm the fifth one. Everyone before has done it entirely differently. I suspect that I will do it the same way I wrote sports columns and city columns. You do some reporting, and then out of that emerges a take.
Now, will you be taking cues? I mean, will it be your interest or will it be reader interest?
Well, ultimately, I'll have to be interested.
Yeah.
But the first pass really will come out of the email bag and see what people are interested in. That's always dangerous, of course, because they're mostly complaining about something. But maybe there's something to complain about.
What are your main areas of interest in contemporary sports kind of culture right now? What draws you?
I mean, ESPN is very important because for most people, I think it's the main window onto sports and sports culture. And we probably agree that sports is important as a definer of values. Right. All the years that I have written witheringly about ESPN, for which I've also worked, I must say, it's been the conflict of interest, wondering how you deal with that interface where you are fiduciary partners in the game, and then you are supposedly covering it in any kind of honest journalistic way.
How do you think ESPN has been doing? Is this a necessary conflict? And are they doing a pretty good job of policing
it's a necessary
themselves?
conflict if they're going to have any kind of journalism presence, which is probably a good thing for them to have. A couple of weeks ago, I probably would, trash ESPN.
Now that they're paying
a couple
you.
of weeks from what I realize now is that I, all these years, haven't had access. I mean, they're not giving me subpoena power, as far as I know, but I believe that anybody at ESPN who doesn't answer my call, it's a guilty plea. So I hope to get to the bottom of it. I mean, a very good example, and before my watch, of course, is Jason Collins comes out.
And this is the NBA player who is, I guess, the first more or less active player in a professional sports league, male, to come out as gay. Right.
And one of their prime NBA reporters, in discussing it a couple of days later, said that homosexuals are walking in open rebellion to God and Jesus Christ. He's also against premarital sex, any kind of sex, unless it's between a married man and a woman. The basic question is, was he led into that statement on an ESPN show where he was asked what his personal views were? Was it a declaration and a white paper?
Why would that matter?
I think it would matter a lot. I don't know, certainly in any kind of standards and practices, does a reporter have the privilege of an opinion about something that we expect he's covering, whatever objectively means. So it would matter. If he was a columnist, it wouldn't matter.
In trying to kind of speak to a broad audience of sportsgoers, should they have people who think that homosexuality is against God's will because that would reflect part of their
As long as
viewership
they're
or-
broadcasting in America,
Yeah.
and a big chunk
Right.
of the population feels that way, you bet.
Yeah.
Freedom of speech, and I think people have a right to be wrong.
Right.
But the question is, within a journalistic construct, is that appropriate?
And so you've talked about, I mean, this partly you're going to try and bring more transparency. I mean, that's the role of the ombudsman too.
I consider myself the window washer.
Yeah. With ESPN as a kind of institution, do you feel, I always thought that in a way, I mean, early on especially, it seemed snarky, but that was very different and it was very refreshing in sports coverage because for a long time, I think you and a number of other people were different than kind of typical sports writers in that they brought some edge and some critical distance or some irony to the games or in the industries that they covered. Yeah. Do you think overall ESPN has been a positive influence on the way that we talk about
Well,
sports?
you're talking about a very specific time in ESPN's career when it wasn't ESPN.
Right.
Now we're talking about Keith Olbermann and Dan Patrick in particular, who had their own SportsCenter show.
Right.
And they had not been told that irony was over,
Right.
nor sarcasm or parody or anything like that. And they were refreshing, and certainly compared to most of the ex-jock, blow-haired guys on television, they were wonderful. ESPN ultimately, I think, became uncomfortable with that as they became more institutionalized, as they got into bed with the leagues. And ultimately, as we know now, they are probably the main donors for ABC and Disney.
Right.
So that no longer exists. Was ESPN a positive force? Well, let's take a step back. Is sports a positive force in America? Sometimes it is and sometimes it's not. I guess a lot of the sports that ESPN and the other networks cover is not a positive force any more than any other kind of entertainment. Because there's two levels of sports in America. One is, of course, celebrity sports, and the other is what you do with your body in public.
Right. Where do you go now for good sports writing? What are your favorite writers or places, sites?
I think that there's more good sports writing than there's ever been, more smart, intelligent people. The only person, however, who I never fail to read is Dave Zirin. I think that he's brought something absolutely new and fresh to sports writing.
And he is bizarrely the sports editor of the
well, he's
of
more
the
of the
Nation.
nation.
So,
Yeah,
right.
I mean
So,
that's.
Well, what do you like? What's he bringing that
well,
is?
everything is politically based.
Right.
He covers nothing without giving us its political ramifications and antecedents.
And in that sense, I think he could be seen as a kind of protege of you or an epigon of yours.
I would like to think so.
Well, because
he's much smarter and stronger in those areas than I ever was. But I would like to take a piece of
well,
credit.
I mean, one of the things that you did early on in a way that was kind of unannounced, and thankfully gained a wide readership, but that you were talking before about sports, has multiple levels, but you didn't treat sports as a world unto itself. It's really important as a kind of reflector of American culture, and it creates a feedback loop where what happens in sports affects us throughout culture, politics, you name it, business, and vice versa. So let's talk a little bit about that. Reason is in its 45th year of existence. We started in 1968 by a guy who I believe...
And I don't read you for your sports coverage.
That's right. That's probably a wise decision. Set the scene for us in the mid-60s when you started sports writing. What was the expectation when people looked at sports and when people read about sports? What were they after? What were they interested in?
The quintessential event, where I also believe the 60s began, was Muhammad Ali fighting Sonny Liston, the heavyweight championship. Here was a 22-year-old boxer, never beaten anybody of note, had no reason in the world to be fighting the heavyweight champion, but boxing needed a sacrificial version for the box office.
And he wasn't even a true heavyweight, really, at that point, or he had just bumped up.
Well, he had won the light heavyweight title in the
Rome.
Olympics in '60. He had been on the cover of Time magazine when that meant something, but that was only because of the bad poetry that he didn't even write that he was reading in
Right.
coffee houses. So here he comes to fight the heavyweight championship, 7-1 odds.
Right. And Sonny Liston, I mean, for those of us, or for our viewers who don't remember who Sonny Liston is, who was Sonny Liston?
Sonny Liston was Grendel's mother. Sonny Liston was the unbeatable thug. He'd come out of prison to knock everybody out. The NAAC begged other black fighters not to fight him because it would be bad for the movement. He was just kind of a glowering monster.
Yeah, he was famous for not really being particularly talkative or
Didn't talk.
glared a lot.
And he, his fists did his talking
Yeah.
for him. He generally knocked people out in the first round, which is what made my career. When Cassius Clay, as Muhammad Ali was then called, went to fight Liston, the real boxing writer didn't really think it was worth his time. So they decided to send a kid from Night Rewrite. And that was me. And my instructions were, as soon as I got to Miami, is rent a car and drive back and forth between the arena where the fight was going to be held and the nearest hospital. So I would waste no deadline time following Cassius Clay into intensive care, which I did. I went to his, that same day, I parked and went to his gym where he worked out. He wasn't there yet, but the Beatles were looking for a photo op. And I think that day, in February 1964, was really me, the Beatles, and Cassius Clay. That was the beginning of the 60s.
You know, and you're kind of you're the only one who's still got it together now, too.
Well, we were all together in the same room, the six of us.
Yeah.
I was the fifth Beatle. But also lurking out in the neighborhood was Malcolm X, who had been asked to keep a low profile in return for 2 tickets to the fight, because the promoter was afraid that people wouldn't come if they knew that Cassius Clay was on his way to becoming a Muslim.
When you showed up there, did you realize that this is, you know, this isn't about a boxing match. This is about we're about to enter a new world where Cassius Clay can reinvent himself as Muhammad Ali, and, you know, the Beatles made many different things possible.
I was much more grandiose than that.
Yeah.
I thought this was a chance for me to get a byline in the paper.
Yeah.
No, I was a total careerist. I mean, this was very exciting for a kid off Night Rewrite to get some feature stories. And, you know, the Beatles were great.
Yeah.
And Ali was wonderful, Clay. We were about the same age. There was a real age gap. Most of the reporters and columnists down there, it was a heavyweight fight after all, were older men, older white men. And they were all in Sonny Liston's camp, where Joe Louis was, you know, the great
Floyd Patterson
boxer. Yeah.
Well, talk about that, because one of the things that is fascinating, and especially if you come to Ali after he is, you know, the heavyweight champion, the king of all kings and whatnot, it's hard to believe that sports writers weren't always falling over themselves, praising him and trying to kind of sniff his jock. Why did sports writers dislike Muhammad Ali or Cassius Clay so
Well,
much?
first of all, on the most basic level, he was an unorthodox fighter. The received wisdom is that the only way to box was by slipping punches, which basically meant you moved your head one side or the other, and the punch harmlessly travels. He leaned backwards. Well, obviously he was going to get caught and get knocked out, but he was so incredibly fast for a big man. He treated sports writers with not contempt, but, you know, a certain familiarity, which they did not like. They were, you know, gentlemen of the press. They wanted particularly black boxers to be grateful for this opportunity to become Americans. And so in every way he was offensive. And really the point was he didn't deserve this fight in the way a contender moves up. It would be just a little bit later, as America is pulling apart over the Vietnam War, that they pull apart over Cassius Clay than Muhammad Ali. But at that moment, just before he became heavyweight champion, he was this kind of cute kid who was going to get his head knocked off. And it was really sad, but it would be fun to watch.
Right. Talk about Ali, because, I mean, he is somebody who you, over the course of your career, you've kind of intersected with at various points, and you've talked...
He's been my story since 1964.
Well, and how does he exemplify a kind of change in American culture and American sports culture and the way that we think about sports?
Well, and once he's idiosyncratic, because he really helped people like me who wanted to write more social and political aspects of sports. And so he brought all of that in. I think in 1964, people saw sports as this sanctuary, and a lot of people still do, sanctuary from real life, as this kind of this American campfire where the whole family could come together in this really non-threatening way. I mean, we could fight about, Mets versus Yankees or Red Sox, whatever, but that's kind of play boxing.
Right.
It really didn't matter. And so we didn't really have to talk about the issues that we really should be
So we didn't
examining.
have to talk about race, class, or
Race,
gender?
No, it certainly didn't exist. And it was a world in which women did not exist. We did not let women into the press box, much less the locker room. No place for women. We did not cover women's sports. I think that we were tolerant to, this is mainstream white America, tolerant to black athletes as long as they hewed a certain line. And even Sonny Liston, thug that he might have been, hewed that line. He was the black boogeyman that we had tamed. He wasn't mugging us anymore. We put gloves on him. So
he's like Mighty Joe Young or something. I mean, he's a
trained
beast.
And we dragged him in from the jungle, but we owned him.
And so that helps explain why the press, as Ali got literally and figuratively more and more outspoken as he changed from Cassius Clay, the Louisville Lip, into this monster, like a black man who dared speak whatever he said. That helps explain why sports writers were like, oh my God, this guy's insane.
They had to say that.
Yeah.
I mean,
they believed.
Yeah.
Too.
What if Paul Robeson had become a pro football player?
Right.
You might have had some of the same situation.
Right. Beyond even issues of race, but also individuality and whatnot. I mean, it's always stunning to me, and I'm about to turn 50, and I think of the early ages of, I can remember people arguing about Joe Frazier versus Muhammad Ali, and only later did I realize this was a proxy, it was a proxy battle for the proxy battle between the Soviet Union and, America and Vietnam or whatever. But also people like Joe Namath and Johnny Unitas. It seems like a really stark contrast. And the 60s, by the end of the 60s, suddenly athletes went from being these kind of lantern jaw comic book heroes who really didn't have much to say but were not threatening, and suddenly they're pulling on pantyhose like Joe Namath, or they're openly sleeping with women and wearing Fu Manchu mustaches. How much did sports help fuel a kind of individualization in American culture, or is it mostly that it was representing,
well, I think that
reflecting
when sports opened up to the black athlete, and Harry Edwards, a well-known sociologist, was really the first to say that sports and then America would take on the values of the underclass, because the underclass was taking over sports.
And he, of course, engineered or helped orchestrate the 1968
the Black Power salute at the 68 Olympics. In ghetto sports, kids would wear Argyle socks in track meets to show a little style. They were repressed in so many ways, so that they would make these little movements. The whole, quote, schoolyard basketball, the slam dunk, the kind of the flashy plays, all evolved out of black neighborhoods.
And that eventually got institutionalized in the ABA, but then it was treated as a
early
lesser
on,
league.
But now we're talking the 60s, where a basketball was beginning to struggle between textbook and schoolyard. Schoolyard being what was seen as part of the rebellion of college football players growing mutton chops, defying the coach, Now, you would never get away looking the way you look like now. You're off the team, Nick.
That's right.
I mean, all these things which seem so quaint
Right.
and almost silly now. And then the way Muhammad Ali, Cassius Clay put down his opponents, that's trash talk. Trash talk is really the dozens and joning, which was, Black's Corner chatter.
One of the things that's fascinating is you saw Muhammad Ali as a kind of cultural change agent, somebody much more important than whatever he was doing in boxing. But by the same token, and as much as he pushed against white stereotypes of blacks, he also, and I think of the way that he talked about Joe Frazier, and he ultimately apologized for it, but he actually traded in the crassest kind of racial stereotypes himself,
it's worse than that. Let's not forget that the Nation of Islam was going up against civil rights. They were quite open about it, they believed in segregation.
Right. He also made not so cryptic comments that Malcolm X got what he deserved, right? Because Malcolm X
that's where Muhammad Ali and his current wife and I have some of our issues. I think that he was, in some abstract way, an accomplice in the death. When he said that anybody who defies the Honorable Elijah Muhammad shouldn't live, that was open season. Had he held on to Malcolm, even after his apostasy, I think that Malcolm would have lived.
Why did it take black athletes, say Italian athletes, nobody expected Joe DiMaggio to, in a way he broke a color line in that he kind of transformed, or Hank Greenberg, these white ethnics who came through, but you don't think of them at all as ethnic now, right? Was that the price of their admission to kind of immortal status?
They assimilated.
Yeah.
They were able to assimilate. Hank Greenberg is he predates, of course, Sandy Koufax. And Hank Greenberg really is the great Jewish jock. And yet,
so we're going to have to. Super Jew Mike Epstein he was faking it.
Let's not take anything away from Mike Epstein. Although look at his stats.
Yeah.
But Greenberg really wanted to be seen as a baseball player. That was the path to Americanism. I think in many ways he may have been even more observant than Koufax, neither of whom were they both was really secular Jews. And DiMaggio was very careful, and Life magazine, I believe it was, said something about that, unlike most of his kind, he doesn't talk with his hands or slurp his spaghetti.
Yeah.
So, these guys were up against terrible racism, and they were very careful.
How much did economic power, this is one of the things that I think a lot of analyses of sports kind of leave out, where, Muhammad Ali, you can see him as, he's a great proxy or kind of personification of changes in racial, racial integration and questions about that, and kind of assimilation of some degree of blacks into the mainstream of American culture, because he did, by dint of winning so many fights and coming back again and again, he's everybody's All-American now in an odd way. But the economic power, people like Joe Namath, people like Dick Allen, Oscar Robertson, Joe Pepitone even. These were guys who were able for the first time to really shake off a kind of stultifying economic system where the big team owners in the leagues really, I hate to sound like I'm from the nation, but where the owners really sucked all of the surplus value out of their players. And that broke down, and that seemed to open things up. Can you talk a little bit about how the rise of free agency in sports mirrors larger shifts in American culture?
Well, I think I would go back even a little further, back to the 60s again.
Right.
Where the quintessential sport, I think, was tennis. Now, tennis players were amateurs for the most part. And how did they manage to live? Well, they were paid under the table to show up at tournaments, to win matches, which kind of kept them in total thrall to the owners and the officials. It was really Billie Jean King, more than anybody, who broke that system and brought us out of amateurism into professionalization of tennis. And I think that was the first big
How
break.
did she manage to do that?
By-
Because she's also a trailblazer in other really interesting
Right,
ways as
by,
well.
by threatening strike,
Right.
the women wouldn't play. And they had very little to lose. They certainly weren't
Right.
even getting paid as much under the table as the men were. So that was an important thing. And I think that there are, the revolutions start small and they start regionally.
Yeah.
And I think this is what happened in sports. I mean, all of a sudden, everybody else started thinking, I'm really being messed over.
Right.
The idea that, the team that you signed with as a teenager owns you for life,
Right.
whether you don't want to live in Philadelphia or
Right.
not. The football players who saw that colleges were, quote, stacking them, that the intellectual positions like quarterback, center, middle linebacker could only go to white men.
Right.
And I think that in baseball, the idea of this plantation system was
Right.
kind of most obvious. So Kurt Flood,
Right.
in
The outfielder
Kurt
for the
Flood was an
Cardinals.
outfielder for the
who-
St. Louis Cardinals who was
Excellent.
traded to Philadelphia and
Right.
didn't want to go.
Right.
And he called himself a $90,000 a year slave, which of course the sports writers all laughed about.
Right.
$90,000 a year slave.
Right.
But of course he was.
Yeah.
And I think that resonated with black players. He lost his case to the Supreme Court. But eventually, a few years later, it was two white players who were able, through arbitration, to create free
And
agents.
that was Messerschmitt and Dave
Yeah.
McNally. Talk about Billie Jean King a little bit more, because you said that in a lot of ways her role in tennis, or kind of by threatening to withdraw, her services, which people wanted to watch, that helped gain. She got some economic power, which changed things.
The ultimate feminist power is to withhold.
Yeah.
Right.
So she's like the Lestrada of tennis.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
And then she emerged later in the 70s. I mean, she had that great spectacle with Bobby Riggs,
Right.
where he was the male chauvinist pig. She beat him in a singles match. And in a lot of ways, that signaled, if not parity between male and female sports, but athletes, it said something.
Well, it gave enormous impetus to the ultimate enforcement of Title IX. So Billie Jean King, she's my favorite athlete, by
Right.
the way, and I think the most important of my time. But not only did she, I think, break open this, this religion
Right.
of amateurism, is this
Yeah.
very dirty part of sports, but she was representing at least half the population of the world,
Right.
women. Part of taking control of their bodies,
Right.
was taking control of their sports possibilities.
And then she took it even further, because she also took control of her sexuality in a public way of saying,
Right.
okay, well, I'm not going to go along.
and
I'm not
paid
going to go
for it.
along to get along.
And
Yeah.
paid for it. I mean, I think that she was in the closet,
Yeah.
and she was kind of unfortunately outed in a palimony case.
Right.
So I mean, I think she came out before her time.
Right. But nonetheless, and that's interesting that she may be more representative or exemplary than even Muhammad Ali in
absolutely.
terms of just the great individualization
Right.
of American culture over the past 45
and I think
or
in
50
many
years.
ways that was kind of hardcore and real. Muhammad Ali really has to do with your feelings and the emotional and political sensibilities you attach to him.
Right.
Muhammad Ali, again, idiosyncratic and not like anybody else, also made people brave. I think that was his most important function, was a symbolic function. I don't think laws were changed because of him, but I do think that certainly among young black men who saw this beautiful black man standing up to the man,
Right.
among athletes, who when he refused to step forward and be drafted, he was immediately barred from
stripped,
boxing
yeah.
for 3.5 years. And athletes all over the world saw, well, if they can do that to Muhammad Ali, they can do that to anybody. So either we roll over and play dead, or we change the system. And athletes being, risk-taking people. The Black Power salute in the '68 Olympics came out of a Olympic movement started by the sociologist Harry Edwards that included a number of demands, some Olympic-based, but one that Muhammad Ali get his license returned to fight. So this was all part of what was then called the Athletic Revolution and the Black Athletic Revolution, which failed. Muhammad Ali has, until very recently, has never made any of Michael Jordan kind of money. And the two young men, Tommy Smith and John Carlos, were effectively squelched for many, many years. But I think that everybody saw what had happened, and a new and stronger generation came out of that.
Going a little bit earlier, back in the 60s, you co-wrote Dick Gregory, best known as a comedian. Dick Gregory's provocative, controversial, best-selling autobiography, which he called Nigger.
Right.
My understanding of it is that he had said, his mother asked him why he would ever name his book that, and he said something along the lines of, if they're going to call it to me, if they're going to call me that anyway, they might as well advertise my book.
Right.
The opening of that book, and what's interesting is that Gregory is in many ways an interesting confluence of somebody who became a political activist, started out running on a track scholarship at, I think, University of Southern Illinois, which is effectively the South. Talk a little bit about your participation in that book and the writing of it, because that opens, and it's somewhat hard to find, and people are reticent to even talk about it because of its title. But the opening section of that is this incredible, great set piece of black rage, where Gregory actually talks about his upbringing and is particularly mad at his absent father. Can you talk a little bit about how you came to be involved with that project and how the writing process on that worked?
Well, Greg had turned down every other writer in New York for the project, and so the publisher was scraping the bottom of the barrel, and they found this kid on Night Rewrite again, and sent me over to his hotel room the day after the Birmingham bombings, when these 4 little girls were killed. I got there and I was told that Greg was in another room and couldn't be bothered. I was Robert Lipsyte of the New York Times. And so I walked in and sat down, and here's this man in his underwear blubbering on a bed. And he looked up and he began, for the next maybe 4 or 5 hours, people like you murdering those little girls. So I really got 4 or 5 hours of that black rage, and I was stunned. And I listened to it. And I think that was the beginning of our relationship. My father was head of what was called the 600 schools for emotionally disturbed boys, primarily black, in New York City. And so I would visit him in schools a lot, and he really was not a leftist, but he was certainly believed in social justice and what was happening to what he called the underserved population. So between my dad and Gregory, that was a white boy's education in what was really happening in the world. So Greg is a major sports fan.
Right.
And so we talked sports a lot.
Do you think race relations have improved significantly since the 60s? And what was the role of sports in kind of, if not changing things, but creating a place where people could talk about this?
Yeah, I think it has. If no other reason, then until he died a couple of years ago, my closest friend was black, and we never would have really gotten together or found ways to make the initial contact if it hadn't been for change and for sports and being able to have this non-threatening water cooler to hang around. I think that Jackie Robinson certainly gave people an opportunity to start learning how to love and hate African Americans individually rather than as a group.
So it is still okay to hate black players on the Boston Red Sox?
Particularly on the Boston Red Sox.
Okay. Yeah. But it's because they're Red Sox.
Yeah. But I think that might be a little racist.
Yes.
I think you want to hate everybody on the Boston Red Sox. We haven't come anywhere near where we should be. Of course, we've come a long way. Is it because of sports? I don't know. I think Harry Truman integrated the Army first. So there were a lot of, and that's very important.
Right.
Certainly, I had Army friends, who were close for that moment. So I think that, yeah, sure. All these things have helped, and sports has helped as well. I think sports has also offered all sorts of bad values and ruined a lot of cities.
Well, let's talk about that, because I think it was in '66 or thereabouts, you wrote a book called The Masculine Mystique.
Yeah.
And this is a kind of fascinating counter, not to feminism, but really kind of an acknowledgement that there were kind of crusty codes of maleness that have certainly changed, enormously. What it means to be a man now is very different than what it meant in '66, much less in '46 or 1906.
I'm not sure that has changed for the better, by the way.
Okay, well, let's talk about that, because among the ways that sports promote bad values, I mean, one is and you've written about this, a kind of sense of entitlement. It's very much where you get to be the prince of the world, and everything is just for your taking because you're good at hitting a ball or throwing a pass or something like that. So talk a bit about the negative.
Well, let's talk about sports and the changes. In the 60s was kind of the dying sensibility that sports was a crucible of character, that it was within sports that boys would become men,
and women would become spectators,
and women would learn to serve them properly. Right. That changed, but at the same time, when I was growing up in the 50s, a man was somebody, and this goes back to the frontier, was somebody who protected and provided for his family and other people's little children. He was stoic and brave, and he had all these kind of good qualities. Whether he did or not, didn't matter. That sensibility existed. I don't think that sensibility exists now with these banksters on Wall Street. I mean, are these men? Jamie Dimon is a man in this society? You have to be joking.
Was John D. Rockefeller a man?
No, absolutely not. He took advantage of all these people who believed in, this idea of, which never truly existed. I mean, as we know, Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett were basically real estate speculators.
Which I'm not necessarily against it. I was going to say, at least unlike Jamie
You're trying
Dimon,
to sell something?
I'm always trying to sell. If you're not selling, you're missing business. But I mean, at least Rockefeller sold cheap oil to people in a way that Jamie Dimon, it remains to be seen what product will save his soul.
Well, I'm glad that Rockefeller has a defender.
Yes, very much so. But and also one who's not related to him, by the way, sadly. But then talk about it in terms of sports figures. I mean, because even Babe Ruth, who was obviously a philanderer and in many ways a horrible human being, his public image was that of, kids stay in school, even orphans like me, if you work hard and, keep your nose. And now we have, there's reality shows about cast-off NBA, not even wives necessarily, but baby mamas.
Right.
Has sports fueled that kind of sense of simultaneously male entitlement and total lack of responsibility?
Sports has fueled the entire Gilded Age that we live in now. Yeah. Of course, sports is part of it. I mean, I think something happened, towards, the dark part of free agency and self-ownership among athletes was the enormous commercialization and commodification of sports, where sports suddenly became an entertainment. Now, sports, yes, was always an entertainment, but it really, had to have some sort of cultural, socio-character sensibility. We were rooting for our alma maters, or where we wanted to have gone, or something that represented us in some way. The best example now is the rise of fantasy leagues, which, as reasoned readers probably know better than anybody, is where people pluck real players and create their own teams out of them.
It's like Stratomatic come to life.
Yes, very often to gamble on, or for commercial reasons. But that's as far away as you can get from rooting for something that has some meaning.
Do you feel that sports, as it's actually practiced by grammar schools and high schools and town leagues, has that become a destructive force overall in America?
To a large extent, yeah. I mean, there are really terrific coaches around on the youth sport. I've seen them. There's a Positive Coaching Alliance. There are really organizations that are trying very hard to stem this tide. But if you see this pot of gold at the end of the athletic rainbow, some years ago, you try really hard to get into a Division I school, so you had a chance at the pros. I think now you try really hard to get into a good Pee-wee league for 8 or 9-year-olds, or a good elementary or middle school league, so you have a chance to advance. You have kids, hurting themselves. I mean, this epidemic of brain trauma, which we're seeing now, it's ridiculous to lay it at the feet of the NFL. It didn't happen there. It happened when the kids were 8 or 9 and began those little insults to their brain.
Do you assume that football is basically on a death watch at some time over the future? I mean, it'll almost be like boxing or heavyweight boxing, where it starts to fade.
I don't know. Boxing died because there were no more charismatic heavyweights.
Although it seems to me also that they shifted into things like mixed martial arts and ultimate fighting.
Reason, because all these, they were not going into boxing. These college wrestlers began to go into mixed martial arts. But I think that people love to watch the violence of football. And football really is the last bastion of masculinity, faux masculinity, in America. I mean, they're going to be SEAL Team 6 sniperettes before there's going to be a female linebacker, right? So this last chance to watch these really big guys, whale the crap out of each other. It's very exciting. So is it on its deathbed? It would be on its deathbed if decent parents and grandparents didn't allow their little boys to become peewees, didn't allow them to play tackle football till they're 15 or 16, if ever. And it would be on its deathbed if millions of fans, were conscience struck and say, just for my pleasure, I can't watch these winsome boys.
So in other words, you're saying it's not on its deathbed at all?
How many people have said, we've had enough drone strikes already?
Well, they're getting there. We had a 13-hour filibuster on it, so maybe Rand Paul needs to filibuster the NFL.
It could happen. For your 50th anniversary.
Yes. You have written in favor of paying college athletes, or of rather changing the college system so that maybe you don't have to waste a couple of years and possible injuries in a college setting where you're really not getting paid much. Talk a little bit about that, and why is that so controversial?
I think it would be a death knell to the football factories, to those institutions of higher learning that have mortgaged their souls to their stadiums and their teams. They found out, and it really works. I mean, Notre Dame is a beautiful example of a very good university that's really known for its football team more than for its research facilities or its library. I remember once we set up a camera on the campus near the grotto, and
Can you explain for some of the viewers who are not privileged enough to grow up in a Catholic universe what the grotto is?
The grotto is it's really a religious grotto where you can go and pray, but more stunning to a non-Catholic than that is overlooking the stadium is this giant fresco of Jesus with his arms out, which is known among the cognoscenti as Touchdown Jesus. So we shot 100 boys walking past, and perhaps 98 of them had first heard about Notre Dame watching or listening to games with Dad.
I mean, that would explain why the kind of, I guess, people who run Notre Dame and people who went there would be against paying athletes, because then, their business model is kind of screwed. But why are so many it seems like many sports writers are against the idea of paying athletes what they actually, some large portion of what they deliver in terms of spectator value. Where does that come from?
Well, you'd have to talk to those dummies yourself. I think that maybe they are still invested in some sort of, I was going to say 20th, 19th century model of what sports is about and what they are covering. I mean, I think a lot of them, and when we talk about sports writers, we're also basically talking about all these people who, and particularly in smaller markets, but anywhere, who are invested in one way or another in the team, which gives them their city and themselves and their station or their paper some sort of, quote, major league status, where Michigan State may be the main employer in town. At hard times there, with loss of his job too. So I think that's, it's that kind of corporate journalism is all mixed into that.
You also are rare in speaking, not uncritically, but positively about performance-enhancing drugs and steroids. You yourself, you've talked about and you've written about your battles with cancer and the way in which steroid treatments allow you.
Yeah, I'm a user.
Why are performance-enhancing drugs seen, which have been in sports from the beginning? I mean, there is no Tour de France without performance-enhancing drugs going back to the first or second year of that race. But now it seems that the worst thing in the world that an athlete can do, they can train as much as they want, they can lift weights as much as they want, but if they take a pill or shoot something, that's verboten. Where is that coming from?
Well, it's taking the pill or shooting something that enables them to train as hard as they want. I mean, I've been shooting up for 20 years. I still can't crush a fastball. But I guess it's an aspect of control. I mean, the anti-doping wonk somehow moved in. It's a way of controlling athletes. I mean, I cannot believe that the NFL, doesn't paddle on a river of steroids. How could that be? So big, so fast, so powerful. But I think that the anti-doping forces or the NFL or whatever has decided, let's not go there. Baseball, it didn't really matter that much. I mean, it doesn't seem as if attendance has dropped as home run output seems to have dropped in recent years. Do we desperately need the higher, faster, bigger, the greater bangs, the spectaculars that we seem demanding of these guys? And the owners are demanding of their players.
And the players mostly are willing to do this.
Are you kidding? They'll do anything. I mean, on that level, number one, they'll do anything to stay up there. To get up to that level and to stay up that level. And secondly, I've talked to a lot of players about this. I've never, ever had somebody say, I do it and it's a bad thing and I feel badly about it, but I want to stay in the bigs. Nobody sees there's anything wrong with this. I mean, you're supposed to have LASIK surgery for your eyes. You're supposed to do all kinds of supplements. You're supposed to kill yourself in training, sacrifice so many aspects of your personal life. What's the big deal? And meanwhile, these actors that we love to hobnob with, they've all been fixed.
Right. Body modification is the future, right? Do you think people like Mark McGwire, Sammy Sosa, Barry Bonds, should they be in the Hall of Fame despite, Alex Rodriguez, despite obviously having used performance-enhancing drugs, at least in some cases in contravention of existing baseball policies?
First of all, I don't vote. I was very grateful to work for the New York Times where you're not allowed to vote, because that was seen as a conflict of interest. Second of all, what's the Hall of Fame? What the Hall of Fame is basically an almost 100% jump in the value of your card and of your appearance at card shows. So is it the Nobel Peace Prize? Should I care about that?
And let's face it,
last couple of people who got it.
But so, I mean, the Hall of Fame is one of those. Are you arguing that it's kind of one of those last redoubts where people can pretend that kind of politics and meaning doesn't intrude into sports?
Yeah, I mean,
it's it's a boy's bedroom.
I have no opinion. It's a treehouse that I've not been invited to.
Yeah. You've also managed for essentially the entirety of your career to be a novelist, particularly a young adult novelist. Your first book, I believe, or first novel was The Contender, which came out in the late 60s or mid-60s. And is widely read still. You've done other books since then. What got you into writing young adult novels? And what pleasure do you get from that, and what function do you think that they serve?
Well, I had always wanted to write fiction. I mean, that's what I started out doing. That's why I became a sports writer, so I could write fiction. I've always wanted to write fiction. And one night at a Muhammad Ali fight, an old boxing manager told me about 3 flights of stairs up to his gym that he owned years before, and that someday he would hear the steps of a hesitant kid coming alone at night. And that kid desperately wanted to be somebody. He would come up these dark stairs because he wanted to be a contender. And the image just totally inflamed me.
And then that became a book about a young black kid who is struggling between the kind of discipline it takes to be a boxer and other pursuits. And you've written several sequels.
And he never became a really good boxer.
Right.
But it was that discipline that turns his life around. And I wrote it, and at a time that they were inventing, Harper and Row at that time, HarperCollins, was inventing this new genre, young adult fiction. It was linear, it had a 17-year-old character, there was no sex in it, I only wrote about what I knew at that time. And so they made it into a YA novel, and it was right for its time. But what happened was, up until that time, I'd been a sports writer for around 10 years by then, up until that time, I was either a genius or a jerk, depending on whether sports fans agreed with what I was writing. But with this audience, and I went into schools, because I think it was important for some reason. Teachers thought it was important for kids to see I was white. The protagonist was black. And these kids were so open about the characters. They talked about my characters as if they existed, and they argued with me about things that my characters had done. It was an absolutely thrilling experience to realize that there were these people out there who could appreciate this fiction on that level. I had written old adult fiction with less success. And also that you could really kind of reach out and touch a kid, and change a kid. I mean, so after that, it took a while before I wrote another one, but it's been a constant thread. I still do it.
Talk about One Fat Summer, which some of us are fond of as well. What was the genesis of that? And give us the
when I was 13, 14 years old, I was very fat. I had my own, I tell kids I had my own zip code. It gets less and less of a laugh every year.
That's right, yeah.
And, but it was semi-autobiographical. I lied about my age at 14. I had this terrible job cutting grass in a man's yard. And in the course of that summer, I lost maybe 40 pounds. I don't know, because I had come to a point where I didn't weigh myself anymore. I was afraid I was hitting 200 already. And I always wanted to write a novel about that. So for many years I wrote, I was writing. By 14 I was a writer.
Would you say that a theme throughout all of your work is one about kind of personal control or self-control? I mean, it's kind of interesting. I hadn't thought about that before, but in many ways, the way you talk about sports, professional sports, but also in some of your fiction, that seems to be a recurring theme. The importance of learning how to discipline yourself.
I wrote a novel which is pretty much banned everywhere called Raiders Night, a football novel. Primarily banned because it was the dark side of high school football, and this is not a good thing to do when someday ESPN might have a high school football channel.
I'm not familiar with that, but what's the plot of Raiders?
Well, the plot is, a kid sees the team hazing somebody into a great, breakdown. Right. And so he's torn between doing what I would have considered the right thing and what would have been best for the team, is keeping it suppressed. But the point was that around the country there are these kind of maverick football coaches who assign this book. And I'll go, anybody who does, I'll go out there and talk to the team. And what's so interesting in that same idea of kids taking YA fiction seriously is the battle on the team between whether or not my hero did the realistic thing. Right. And half the team was, that is so messed up. You never do that. You take care of yourself, man. That's what sports is all about. They say, no, you're a captain, you're a stand-up guy, you do the right thing, you take care of little people. And it was kind of thrilling because it kind of, I would like to think it's recapitulating some struggle in our society, but I don't see the good side so much. Right.
Reason loves economics. We like to talk about economics and the way it infuses things that don't present themselves as such. With sports, has, in the past, let's say before free agency, broadly speaking, and this may be simplistic or just wrong, but, the owners basically, they got all the money. Fans paid relatively small prices for tickets. The athletes got screwed. The spectators got what they wanted. The owners got a lot. Then with free agency,
they didn't get that much.
Okay. Who? The owners? Okay. So.
I mean, to a large extent, and now we're talking, 50s, 60s, many of those owners had their team as their primary business and source of income. That's hardly the case now. Right. The players tended to live in the same neighborhood as their middle-class fans, and always had winter, off-season jobs.
The selling aluminum siding, insurance, pressing flesh at casinos.
Exactly. And the fans could generally take the whole family to a ball game.
Now, then after this, I mean, it's clear that, owners make a lot of money with their teams, and despite every year, every NFL team, somehow loses money. Every major league team, in any sport loses money, but they do pretty well. The athletes do very well. Even the mediocre athletes have a collective bargaining agreement that works for them. And the fans get screwed arguably in two ways. One is that ticket prices are massively expensive. And then also as taxpayers, because it includes even people who don't give a shit about sports. Is that the way that sports has grown up? Is it this, grown into a huge global business that it's really extracting money from taxpayers through various kinds of subsidies? I mean, how big a factor is that?
That's an enormous factor. Yeah. I mean, for starters, even if a team loses money, and I would have to see the books. Right. I mean, other than Green Bay, they're all, you can't see the books of any football team. Even if it's losing money, what does it do for Domino Pizza, which is the main business of the guy who owns the stadium? Whether it's entertaining people in his box, larger visibility, becoming a power in his community and being able to ram through that bond issue, which means that you and I pay for the ballpark, with even more luxury boxes. Yeah, that's what's happening in sports, as sports becomes this entertainment conglomerate with lobbyists. I mean, the NFL has lobbyists, and the NFL is a nonprofit corporation. That's where sports is, and fans complain, and so they'll watch the games on television, on ESPN, for which they are paying higher premium rates to their cable server.
Is there any way, what's a possible intervention in that, so that just to bring it to a kind of elemental, soft social justice, that people who like sports pay for them and people who don't have to pay for them?
I think that's fair enough. I mean, I'm less sympathetic with the fact that, it costs you a couple of $100 to take your kids to a ballpark. That's a choice, and you can have your priorities. Don't go to so much opera.
Right. Which is also, by the way, taxpayer subsidized and really expensive.
Absolutely.
Yes.
I'm much more concerned with taxpayers subsidizing ballparks that they may not use.
Well, we'll end it there. I want to thank Robert Lipsyte, the sports writer, soon to be ESPN's next ombudsman, for talking with Reason TV about sports, which means talking about race, class, gender, and politics. Bob, thanks very much.
Race. Thank you.
Thank you.